G'day everyone. Welcome to the Decoding the Future podcast. My name is Mahesh and Sean. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Fujitsu here in Australia. And with me today, I have Sean. Sean, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Sean Motsworth. I am Director of AI and IoT for Fujitsu Oceania.
Okay. Look, I think what we're going to be talking today is around we're going to look at the remarkable journey that that we've gone through since ChatGPT was released in November 2022. This technology has basically evolved from a fascinating experiment, like to a tool that millions of people use every day. Now, and we've seen multiple iterations. We've got was it what was it, Sean? That was released? Was it GPT-3? Was the first one that was released? Like
GPT-3 was the original release. Then 3.5, 4, 4.0.
4.0, and then so many releases. And of course, the landscape has changed dramatically. We had other people releasing software as well. We have Claude, Gemini,
Right here.
So we've got so many other.
Strong.
Yeah, Mistral. So, question for you to get things started. So what do you think? Has Gen AI lived up its reputation? World-changing predictions?
I think generative AI has set new peaks for the hype cycle, where new technology gets hyped about how it's going to change the world, and then inevitably it doesn't change the world quite as soon as everybody hopes it would. I think we're on a journey. I think it's definitely starting to change organizations and people. I know a lot of people who use it personally now to help them with things like correspondence and answer questions, not just logging on to the original ChatGPT, but looking at tools like Bing that now has GenAI incorporated directly into it, so you can do a search and then get the a GPT answer to your question as well. Lots of people are using that. It hasn't taken off in organizations, though, quite as rapidly as I think many people thought it would 2 years ago. What do you think, Mahesh?
Look, I think there are two aspects to it, right? One is around the consumer and how they actually see it. Like, just like my daughter, for example, or just general people using it for their own personal use. I think they see a lot of use out of it, and they use it almost on a day-to-day. My kids use it for, to do, I suppose, look up homework and things like that. So they are using it. I think it's changed their lives dramatically as well. Even people like, teachers and so on, they use it. But in the Gartner, it was interesting that, you touched upon the hype cycle. I was over at the Gartner conference, was it a couple of months ago, and they were talking about how, it's kind of like reached the peak of that inflated expectation, and it's just starting to kind of like come down. I think it's a bit of more realistic where it's going to settle down. So you'll have that, I think, So it is just at the peak and just starting to come down at this point in time, I believe. So, yeah, look, I think from that's the consumer expectations on how they use it is very different to enterprises. I think the enterprises still have a long way to go until they fully adopt it. Yeah, I believe. Yeah.
I think Copilot is partially changing things. I think that's it's been a slightly slow adoption of Copilot, but that's starting to change now, and a lot more organizations are starting to use that to integrate with email and Teams and SharePoint documents. And I think that's helping.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Look, I think Copilot is just one of those tools where Gen AI is embedded, and we're going to see more and more of these tools that will have some form of like Gen AI LLM embedded within it, and people will not even realize that it's there. We talk about companies like ServiceNow, for example. Apple is releasing Apple Intelligence, right? It'll be part of the device from now onwards. So you'll see a lot of those things being incorporated in tools or in devices and so on, and people will not even notice it. I think that's when we'll see that adoption go even higher, I believe, anyway. Which brings us to this question, right? So in your line of work, where are you seeing customers generally adopt it?
Yeah, as director of AI and IoT, sometimes it feels like every second question I have is about generative AI.
Mm.
Lots of organizations are asking about it. Lots of organizations are talking about it, and some of them are starting to move and actually do POCs and actually get things into production. I think the primary usage is very much around using it to ask questions of an organization's knowledge base. So lots of we've talked to government departments who have lots of policy documents, and all their staff need to understand their policy documents. And having a tool where you can just ask a question of what's the tax law for Western Australia, something like that, for a particular area, and it can come up with the answer and summarize the answer in a few bullet points really quickly. That's tremendously powerful. So we're seeing a lot of customer-facing type solutions like contact center staff starting to look at solutions like that. There's the retrieval augmented generation design pattern, or the RAG pattern, where you upload documents into a database and then use a large language model to query them. Still seeing a lot of interesting use cases about that, and starting to see lots of organizations are starting to roll out that type of solution. I think that's primarily what I'm seeing at the moment. There are a few organizations doing some more interesting things. Not that RAG solutions aren't interesting, but using it to do using OCR and generative AI tools to scan information and summarize and classify documents, things like that. And we did a really interesting POC for a customer where we were doing video analytics and then using a generative AI tool to summarize information from the video. That really highlighted the power of what we could do.
It's interesting, right? I mean, if I look at it, I think if I look at the evolution of how it's progressing, people are first looking at it, and then in terms of, hey, look, just use the chat engine because it's the easiest way that they can actually get started, and they start typing in questions and getting their answers, and that's how it's been. But then very quickly people realize, hey, look, the foundation models have been trained, and the training has finished at a certain date. It doesn't know information about any of the company information and things like that. And we need to set up an internal knowledge base. It's not able to get information from that. And so you kind of like start looking at things like RAG solutions and tapping into the internal, I suppose, data, wealth of information that's there in the company documents and all that kind of stuff. And they're pulling that in, and then people are still using some kind of maybe a chat interface or something like that, right? But I think the next step in that evolution is to start generating content as well. I mean, I think one of the things that you didn't mention that you kind of like missed out on, and I think we do it a lot of times, is its code generation capabilities as well. I think a lot of people are using it in their, the whole dev cycle. But I think the next thing is in an evolution of it is like generating documents and so on and so forth, and how it actually automates that based on existing content and knowledge. But there's also this exotic, I say exotic, right? More kind of like the extreme use case where I know we do that within Fujitsu as well. Is like we've got a bunch of this was work going on, and in things as complex as drug discovery. So you're using GenAI for it. So that's that extreme as well. But that's not like the standard corporate use case. But it can be used for more complex things as well, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of people have been on a journey learning about generative AI over the last 2 years, and discovering some of the challenges that they've had with it and how we can resolve those challenges as well. Largely around the accuracy of the model. If you're using ChatGPT to write some personal correspondence. It generally doesn't matter if it hallucinates a little bit, but if you're using ChatGPT to answer questions for your customers, you want to have absolutely reliable answers. And I, I think the work that we've been doing over the last 18 months or so, since we've been working with generative AI solutions, has really been focused on improving the accuracy and getting better results from non-complex documents, trying to embed some reasoning into the solution and trying to getting a better understanding of what sort of things it can do and the things it can't do. One of the first,
Yeah, I was going to say kind of like it's probably a good idea to cover a lot of the challenges. I know you kind of like mentioned, accuracy and hallucination and things like that, right? But I think it would be good to touch upon all the other challenges that I suppose LLMs kind of like have these days, right? So anything else that you want to kind of like start highlighting just on.
yeah, I mean, I think I covered the main ones. So yeah, around long documents, complex documents, documents with complex tables in them. Sometimes LMs don't understand complex tables with them. Documents with diagrams, images, and charts in them can often be, in a lot of RAG solutions, they can just be missed. Complex reasoning around, yeah, around how to solve problems, relationships between different entities, and understanding relationships between different entities in an organization can be challenging. Doing maths, counting things, like counting how many R's are in strawberry is a particular challenge for GPT models.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the key things that you mentioned over there is around multimodality, right? I mean, when we had ChatGPT released was 2 years ago, I mean, it didn't have that multimodality, but we see that more and more, um, more and more of those foundation models are starting to incorporate it. So it can fundamentally, understand images, the text in those images, and figure out what it means and everything else, which is a bit of a big move from where we were about 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. One of the first solutions we did, we had to load in documents and be able to ask questions of the documents, but we discovered a lot of information in those documents were contained in charts and diagrams that were just totally missing from what we were reading in, and that was a very big learning for us. In that you have to be able to use all the information available to you and be able to surface that in your responses.
Mhm. One of the interesting things that I was actually listening to, I think probably was in the Gartner conference as well, and they were saying that sometimes um, LLMs do better with unstructured data than structured data itself, right?
Yeah.
So maybe sometimes you kind of like change that structure. And you mentioned about tables and everything else, data being in tables. Maybe sometimes you need to convert it into from structured to unstructured. But at the same time, I think you did mention about RAG, right? And we were talking about knowledge graphs and everything else. So that's another area that we could potentially look at where we have that association and so on. So I just want to get your thinking around what do you think are some of the improvements that we can actually do in terms of what is the next step in the evolution, right? What are the things that we should be that's coming up or what should be doing in this space?
Yeah, I think you've already mentioned multimodality. So being able to understand images in documents and understand what's in images as well. You know, if you have a photograph and you being able to use large language models to interpret those. There's been a lot of work um, happening in prompt engineering over the last few years, and it's been really interesting to see how that's evolved. And we're getting some really good structures to prompt engineering happening now, where it's really well structured, and it's getting to the stage where it can define the requirements to the large language model really well. But my prediction is that prompt engineer is not going to be a long-term job in IT because that's going to be taken away from you by large language models. You can ask you can ask a large language model to generate a prompt to get the best results for a particular answer. And I think what we're starting to see now, or over the last 9 months or so of 2024, is that a lot of development in agentic AI. So where large language models are working out how to solve a problem and then using other agents or other large language models that are tuned to best solve particular parts of that problem. So you might have an agent that, if you've got a customer contact center solution, you might have an agent that looks up information in the customer database and returns it. Another agent that looks up consumption from that customer, pulls it all together, and then your controlling agent would ask a question of all that information and provide a response to the original customer, or to the original question. I think, to me, that's the big area of that's going to really fundamentally change how businesses operate. Being able to integrate with a lot of different systems and use AI and multiple different types of AI to answer really specific questions.
That's great. Look, I think I did touch upon, I think just before I started asking about knowledge graph rags or KG rags, right? I think one of the things that I think that I believe we may see a lot of people starting to adopt that as well.
Yes.
If you look at, I suppose, if call it classic RAG, if I can. I know it's, this has been around just for a couple of years, or of course the concept has been around a little bit longer.
Oh, okay.
But it all relies on a vector database where you basically convert whatever word or token into vectors, and you put it into a vector database and things like that. But I think with the knowledge, but one of the things that it actually uses is association, right? And and when you have multiple hops in a question, asking a question like what is the the name of this daughter, the second daughter of the third 21st president of the United States, or something like that, right? It becomes a little bit more difficult for the LLM to figure it out. And this is where you can actually have like a vector database. Rather than a vector database, you have a graph database where you can actually have those associations. And a lot of solutions that people are doing these days are bringing that into into the solution as well. So so that's an area that I think may take off as well.
Yeah. We were talking to a government customer a couple of months ago, and they're using graph databases in a similar way to interrogate complex company structures and be able to understand who actually owns a particular company. And I thought that was a really good example of how in the corporate world and the government world, that knowledge graph type solution can add a lot of value to organizations, and combining it with generative AI, where you can ask the question of the knowledge graph. Say, we've got this company buried down here in a really complex structure, but who are the actual owners? Who's actually controlling it? And that was a really interesting use case, I thought.
Yeah. Another question that I actually get asked quite a bit is around, whether you need to use fine tuning or whether RAG is good enough, right? I mean, like, with the combination of RAG and the right kind of prompting and so on, there's one school of thought that, hey, maybe sometimes you don't need fine tuning as such, right? So I want to get your thoughts about what you think in that area. Like, where does fine tuning kind of like stick into, fit into a lot of these things?
Yeah, for most of our solutions that we've done, we haven't needed to do fine tuning. Fine tuning is generally expensive and time consuming, and you don't want to undertake it unless you really have to. So effectively, what fine tuning does is it lets you do additional training runs of your large language model. So you can provide additional questions that you would ask and specific answers into it, and it retrains the core model to be able to answer those questions. So it can be really useful in things like some medical scenarios or legal scenarios.
In jargons, right? Particularly, yeah.
Yeah, where you've got some very specific knowledge that would not be part of the training set for the core large language model. So you can enhance the LLM to respond a lot better with that very specific knowledge. But in my experience, for most corporate and government organizations, yeah, it's really not needed.
Okay. What about maybe talk a little bit about the vendor landscape itself, right? So I know I mentioned about I know we kind of like briefly mentioned about OpenAI, obviously the leading player. I was looking at one of the graphs that actually showed what portion of the market each and every vendor owns, and OpenAI was this big sphere that own most of it. But you have other players as well, right? Some of them, I mean, Google obviously is pretty big. Anthropic with Claude and so on is quite big. Any other vendors that you are in your radar? I mean, Meta, of course. You
Yeah.
mentioned about Meta.
Yeah, exactly. So Meta produced Llama, which is the most common open source model,
Yeah.
or open weights model, as I like to think of it. But yeah, and to me, that's kind of the number two to OpenAI. They have the peak in the same way that OpenAI have that large chunk of the market in general. The Llama, which is the Meta solution, has most of the open source models are based on Llama. Yeah, it's one of those things that I think is really interesting. You don't know where the next big advance is going to come from. And there are so many companies out there now working on large language models, and you really interesting to see which one is going to come up next. And I think there's the competition, and in terms of everyday use, um, they're all pretty good now. Whether you look at OpenAI, whether you look at Anthropic, Mistral, Cohere, I have some really good models that are tuned for the RAG type solutions. And Fujitsu partner with Cohere, so we've done quite a bit of testing with them, and we did a side-by-side comparison of OpenAI large language model to Cohere, and the responses were very close. It was not with Cohere, which is a much smaller model and not as complex as for OpenAI GPT-4o, we got very similar results for the standard type of questions that business users would ask in a RAG type scenario. Yeah, so yeah, there's lots of really good vendors out there these days, and it's becoming interesting to see which ones you would choose for different scenarios based on price and capability and deployment location.
Yeah, look, I think you mentioned Cohere, right? And I think each and every company or LLM kind of like caters to kind of like a niche, I guess, right? And Cohere basically wants to focus more on the enterprise LLM, and
Yeah.
they do provide like a private, if you wanted a private instance of it, you could actually get it for all the inferencing and things like that. Obviously you need like really big machines with GPU capability to run it, but at least they provide that. But one other thing that we keep, whenever we talk about Gen AI, we kind of like uh, you know we tend to talk more around LLM and the language based ones, but there are plenty of other ones as well, right? I mean, diffusion terms, for example, like stable diffusion, and we have the likes of DALI. I think that's something that we hasn't taken off as much as LLM in terms of popularity, but I think they are going to, we're going to see that come up as well in the field of image generation, generating videos, and all those kind of things. I mean, that is something that we haven't seen as much in the last 2 years. I mean, it's there. I'm not saying it's not there. And those images and videos that I've seen are getting better and better. I mean, gone are the days when you used to get like 6 fingers or 7 fingers and,
It's,
missing limbs and everything else. That's getting fixed as well. So, I mean, that's another area to look out for, right? Isn't it?
yeah, I think in some ways that doesn't have quite so much of a of a business usage. Yeah, and I know there are some usages of image generation in business. Um, yeah, but in things like generating marketing material, logos, things like that. But yeah, it's not that hasn't been quite so popular to date. But it'd be really interesting to see where it goes. I know people in Hollywood are worried that in a few years' time they won't need actors anymore. They'll all be unemployed and we'll be generating all our movies automatically.
Yeah. No, I think it'll be a while, but I think one interesting thing, just as you were talking, was the thing that I picked up was we have all these multi vendors, different vendors, I should say, coming up with their own models and things like that. But I think there will probably be just like when we had the cloud, and in the end we had just about in the end now we have like three hyperscalers. We have Google, Microsoft and Amazon, right? And those are the three people that are there playing in that space, and pretty much the others are, literally kind of like fallen out or operating in a very niche, small space. I wonder whether we'll end up seeing something very similar in this space as well, with the likes of a few like OpenAI and a few others, basically having the bulk of the market, right? And
Yeah,
using that, right?
I think I think at the moment where the power is in large language models and they're so big and expensive to train that it really will end up that only the biggest players can actually fund a $100 million training run.
Yeah.
So that's going to be very limiting for smaller organizations. But I think one of the other interesting developments is in small language models. Yeah, we talk a lot about LLMs that are really powerful, but the use of small language models that instead of having 500 billion parameters, they have 3 billion parameters, but are still good at solving certain tasks. And you mentioned Apple releasing AI capabilities into their iPhone range earlier on. I think that uh, the use of small language models that can fit into mobile devices and run very cheaply, run on low power devices. Yeah, I think there will be definitely be a space for smaller vendors in that area.
Yeah. Look, interesting you mentioned that, Rob, because I run Olama on my Mac, and I've got a few language models running on my Mac, and all the inferencing is done on locally, right? Doesn't even
Yeah.
don't even need a network to go outside and do it. And some of those models are run pretty well in small form factor.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Sean, where do you think people can learn more about some of the stuff, or if they're learning, what are the things that you think people need to focus on generally in this space?
It very much depends on uh, where they're coming from. There are so many different ways you can approach this. So if you just want to learn, well, if you're an organization and you want to learn more about AI and how it can help you, or generative AI and how it can help you, then your best approach is to contact me, and we'll arrange a session, and we'll be happy to help you with your generative AI journey. There are lots of sources on the internet around um, understanding things like prompt engineering and things like that. If you really want to learn how generative AI models work, then yeah. Sorry, I don't have I don't have a good answer to that one. Sorry.
I would say, in things, places like LinkedIn Learning or even YouTube, and there's so many videos in there. Gives
Yes.
you a bit of an
Yeah.
overview of it. And even if you look at some of the vendors, Google, for instance, or OpenAI, I haven't seen about OpenAI, but Google definitely has a whole bunch of good videos to actually get you started, I would say. Right, some of those vendors, Microsoft have released in a whole bunch of learning, a lot of them free for you to actually consume. Probably be a good starting place, I think.
And with Cohere, I know they have Cohere University
Yeah.
for a large language model solution. I think some of the other vendors have that sort of capability as well. So yeah, that's a good point.
Any parting words? Any words of wisdom before we wrap up?
Um, I think yeah, it's been a fascinating journey over the last 2 years, and I'm really interested to see where it's going to go in the next year, in the next 2 years. There's still lots of advances happening in technology. In slightly, well, I'm waiting to see what ChatGPT 5 is going to look like. That's going to have enhancements to the reasoning ability, and I've read it's going to be orders of magnitude better than what ChatGPT 4 is. So I'm really excited about that. But there's also some really interesting developments in models that work in a different way to the GPT architecture that OpenAI have really popularized over the last 2 years. So I'm wondering if the next big development is going to be in a non-GPT model or something that is going to come out of the blue from one of these smaller companies that makes a breakthrough in another technology. It's such an active area of research. It's fascinating. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, interesting. Look, I really keen on seeing how this whole thing evolves. Look, in my look, I've got three things that I top of my mind in terms of like where this needs to go and what people need to look out for. One is around cost. I think I mentioned Gartner a couple of times, and you go to conferences and things like that. Most of these conferences these days just talk about Gen AI and LLMs and stuff like that, right? When they're talking about AI. And one of the things that they actually mentioned was that if you don't fully understand the cost model, the cost could completely blow out. And I think they did mention that it could be about I think they quoted something like hundreds of times more than what people actually expected to be, right? Expected it to be. So I think that's one thing that people need to watch out for. Another thing in my mind when we talk about LLMs and so on is around security. I think we still haven't worked it out.
Yeah.
We have traditional database and we're doing queries and things like that, right? We have all those access-based controls. People we know what information people can see and so on and so forth. But in when you have a lot of unstructured data, I mean, like you suck it into the LLM, and sometimes it may start to reveal things that they're not supposed to reveal. So that's something that we need to watch out for. And I think explainability, I think you touched upon it as well. I mean, some of those models are getting better and better, but I think that is an area where, as we move more towards responsible AI and things like that, people are going to ask this question like, "Hey, how did you arrive at that answer?" Right? That's come, and again, respond. I say explainability. I think maybe even we need to put it under superset of responsible AI. Starting to create content that shouldn't be created. Fake, deep fakes and those kind of things. So I think as we kind of like start looking more and more into space, this is going to be an issue that we all probably need to reckon with, I think. So, these three things.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. We had a few conversations with organizations who are really keen to embrace what generative AI can do for them, but are actually quite nervous about what generative AI can do for them because if it's used wrongly, then it can be a major problem.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you. I think we are ready to wrap up. Thanks for the conversation, Sean. I think it was like a really nice chat. So thank you. And that's all we have for this podcast. It's a wrap.
Thank you, Mahesh.